Montana Territory, 1882. Xavier Hawkins squinted at the distant plume of dust moving across the prairie toward his homestead. The April sun beat down on his weather-worn face as he straightened his 6-foot frame and leaned against his fence post. 3 months had passed since he'd sent away for a mail-order bride, and the stagecoach was finally arriving with a woman who'd agreed to share his life on this remote patch of Montana earth. At 32, Xavier had spent the past 5 years building his cattle ranch from nothing but determination and calloused hands. The 2-story cabin he'd constructed board by board stood as testament to his dream, a dream that had grown lonely in the isolation of the frontier. His nearest neighbor lived 10 miles east, and the town of Silver Creek lay 20 miles south, making for a solitary existence broken only by occasional trips for supplies. The stagecoach drew closer, and Xavier ran a hand through his sandy brown hair, brushing away the trail dust. He'd cleaned up as best he could for this meeting, wearing his one good shirt and the least worn pair of denim trousers he owned. His letter exchanges with Jane Vickers had been brief but promising. She was a 25-year-old schoolteacher from Boston who sought adventure and a new life after losing her parents. Her photograph showed a woman with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile that had struck something in Xavier's heart. As the coach pulled to a stop in his yard, Xavier removed his hat and stepped forward. The driver, old Pete Simmons, gave him a curious look. "Got that special delivery you've been waiting for, Hawkins?" Pete called down, chuckling. Though there might be a bit of a... The coach door swung open, cutting off Pete's words. Xavier stood frozen as not one, but 2 young women stepped down. The first was petite with honey blonde hair tucked beneath a practical bonnet, wearing a traveling suit of navy blue. The second stood taller, with rich auburn hair and a deep green dress that complemented her pale complexion. "Mr. Hawkins?" The blonde spoke first, extending her gloved hand. "I am Julia Vance. We've corresponded these past months." Xavier's brow furrowed. "Julia Vance. I was expecting Jane Vickers." The auburn-haired woman finished for him, stepping forward with a letter in her hand. "Which would be me. I believe there's been some confusion." Xavier looked between the 2 women, his plans for a simple welcome crumbling as he realized what Pete had been trying to warn him about. Somehow, he'd received 2 mail-order brides, and neither was the woman whose photograph he'd been carrying in his pocket. "Ladies, I think we have a problem," he said slowly, his mind racing to understand what had happened. Julia Vance straightened her shoulders. "I have the letters to prove our arrangement, Mr. Hawkins. I sold my possessions and traveled 2,000 miles based on your promise." "As did I," Jane Vickers added, her voice carrying a slight tremble despite her composed expression. "I left everything behind." Xavier removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, acutely aware of Pete and his assistant watching the scene unfold with undisguised interest. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside," Xavier suggested, gesturing toward the house. What he didn't say was that he had no idea how to resolve this situation. His isolated ranch had precisely 1 bedroom besides his own, and no neighbors to offer temporary accommodations. 1 woman he could properly host, but 2 posed an impossible propriety problem in 1882 Montana. As he helped unload their trunks, Xavier's mind whirled with questions. Which woman had he actually been writing to? How had this mix-up occurred? And more pressingly, what was he going to do with the bride he hadn't intended to order? *****. Jane Vickers sat rigidly on the edge of the wooden chair in Xavier Hawkins's surprisingly well-appointed parlor. The cabin's exterior had prepared her for frontier roughness, but the interior revealed a man who valued comfort. Sturdy furniture, shelves of books, and even a small piano tucked in the corner. Directly across from her, Julia Vance appeared equally tense, her gloved hands folded primly in her lap. Xavier returned from the kitchen with a pot of coffee and 3 cups balanced precariously on a tray. His movements were methodical as he poured, giving Jane time to study him properly. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and thoughtful hazel eyes, he bore little resemblance to the dashing figure she'd imagined from his letters. He was handsome in a rugged, unpolished way that spoke of honest work and determination. "I believe I understand what happened," Xavier said, settling into his chair. "The matchmaking service must have confused your applications. I received a photograph of a Miss Jane Vickers, but that photograph wasn't me." Jane interrupted, feeling her face flush. I never sent one. Julia frowned. I sent my photograph with my application. Xavier, Mr. Hawkins, and I have exchanged 6 letters. As have we, Jane countered, producing her own small collection of correspondence. Though I regret not sending a likeness of myself. I was hesitant. Xavier placed his coffee cup down with deliberate care. The letters I received were signed Jane Vickers. I assumed. He trailed off, eyes moving between the 2 women. The matchmaking service likely confused our files, Julia concluded. Both our names begin with J, and our surnames with V. The simple explanation hung in the air, failing to address the central problem. 2 women had traveled across the country to marry one man. Jane felt a hollowness spreading in her chest. After losing her teaching position in Boston when the school closed, and with both parents gone, she had risked everything on this new beginning. I don't mean to be forward, Jane said carefully. But which of us did you intend to marry, Mr. Hawkins? Xavier's expression grew troubled. I entered into correspondence with a schoolteacher from Boston. The letters described teaching experiences, a love of books, and a willingness to adapt to frontier life. Both women nodded. I taught primary school for 5 years, Jane said. And I taught music and literature for 3, Julia added. Xavier looked between them, his expression unreadable. The letters spoke of losing parents recently and seeking a new beginning. Again, both women nodded. The final letter mentioned bringing seeds for a vegetable garden and knowledge of preserving food for winter. That was me, Jane said softly. I mentioned bringing music to brighten your home, Julia countered. Xavier stood abruptly and walked to the window. It seems I've been corresponding with both of you, believing you were one person. He turned back to face them, his expression genuinely distressed. I've made promises I cannot fulfill to one of you. For that, I deeply apologize. Jane felt her hopes crumbling. She had no funds to return east, no family to welcome her back. The silence in the room grew uncomfortable until Julia suddenly rose to her feet. Well, this is quite the predicament, she said with surprising composure. But I believe there's a simple solution. Mr. Hawkins will have to choose which bride he prefers. Xavier's eyes widened in apparent alarm. Miss Vance, I couldn't possibly. Of course you can, Julia insisted. You must decide which of us better suits your needs and temperament. It's the only sensible approach. Jane found herself standing as well. That seems rather cold-blooded, doesn't it? We're discussing a marriage, not purchasing a horse. Julia's smile didn't reach her eyes. Frontier practicality, Miss Vickers. We've all invested too much to turn back now. Xavier rubbed his jaw, clearly uncomfortable. I need time to consider this situation properly. In the meantime, you both need accommodations. He explained that his nearest neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Tate, was a widow who might take in one of them temporarily. He would ride there immediately to inquire, leaving the women to rest from their journey. As Xavier departed, the atmosphere in the cabin grew tense. Jane moved to the bookshelf, seeking distraction, while Julia explored the parlor with critical eyes. He's more rugged than I expected, Julia commented, running a finger along the piano. But this homestead has potential. The cattle operation appears substantial. Jane selected a volume of Wordsworth. You sound as though you're assessing a business venture rather than a potential husband. Julia's laugh was light, but cool. Isn't that precisely what marriage is, Miss Vickers? A practical arrangement for mutual benefit? I left Boston seeking security and a chance to build something meaningful. Romance is a luxury for novels, not real life. Jane considered her own motivations for coming west. Had they been so different? She'd sought escape from dwindling prospects. Yes, but also connection, something Xavier's thoughtful letters had promised. What will you do if he chooses me? Jane asked quietly. Julia's smile turned predatory. He won't. Men like Mr. Hawkins appreciate directness and practicality. Your romantic notions about homesteading are charming but unsuited to the harsh realities of frontier life. Before Jane could respond, she noticed something peculiar on Xavier's desk, a letter with unfamiliar handwriting, addressed from Silver Creek. Curiosity piqued. She moved closer, making out only a fragment of the visible text. Regarding your inquiry about Elizabeth's whereabouts. Who was Elizabeth? Jane wondered. Had there been another woman in Xavier Hawkins's life? The mystery added another layer to an already complicated situation. leaving Jane to question how much she truly knew about the man she'd come to marry. Asterisk, 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 Xavier rode hard toward Eleanor Tate's homestead, his thoughts in turmoil. The older woman had been a godsend when he first arrived in Montana Territory, teaching him about local growing seasons, nursing him through a winter fever, and generally being the closest thing to family he had in these parts. If anyone could help with this impossible situation, it would be Eleanor. As his horse crested the final hill, Xavier caught sight of Eleanor's neat property, a modest cabin with a thriving garden, chicken coop, and small barn. Smoke curled from the chimney, signaling she was home. Eleanor emerged onto her porch before he'd even dismounted, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. At 62, she moved with the vigor of a much younger woman, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Xavier Hawkins," she called out. "Wasn't your bride supposed to arrive today? Why aren't you home welcoming her?" Xavier dismounted with a grimace. "That's the problem, Eleanor. I've got 2 brides, not 1. Eleanor's eyebrows shot up nearly to her hairline. "2 women think they're marrying you? Xavier Hawkins, what have you done?" He quickly explained the situation as Eleanor led him inside for coffee. She listened without interruption, her weathered face giving nothing away until he finished. "So you've left these 2 women alone together in your cabin while they both believe they're to be your wife?" Eleanor shook her head. "Lord help us. This will end in tears or bloodshed." "I'm hoping you might take one in temporarily," Xavier said. "Just until I figure out what to do." Eleanor poured coffee into 2 chipped cups. "I can house one of them, certainly. But you can't delay choosing for long. News travels fast, even out here. 2 unmarried women staying at your property. It'll ruin both their reputations." Xavier nodded grimly. "I know, but how do I choose? I've been corresponding with both, thinking they were the same person. Their letters together formed the woman I thought I was bringing home." "What about this Elizabeth that Sheriff Thompson wrote to you about?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "Have you heard anything more?" Xavier's expression darkened. "Nothing. It's like she vanished after leaving Denver. 3 years with no word." He sighed heavily. "That's part of why I finally decided to send for a bride. I can't keep waiting for a ghost." Eleanor patted his hand sympathetically. "Sometimes we have to let the past rest, Xavier. Now, tell me about these 2 women. What are they like?" Xavier described Jane and Julia as best he could from their brief meeting. Jane seemed gentle but resolute, with an underlying strength in her green eyes that reminded him of the pine forests back east. Julia was more forthright, her confidence apparent in every gesture, her blonde beauty undeniable. "Both seem like fine women," he concluded. "Either would make a suitable wife, I suppose." Eleanor snorted. "Marriage isn't about suitable, boy. It's about finding someone who makes your heart recognize its home." She studied him over the rim of her cup. "Which one did that for you?" Xavier shook his head. "I barely know either of them." "Then get to know them," Eleanor said simply. "I'll take in Miss Vance for now. Bring her over this evening. Tomorrow, take Miss Vickers into Silver Creek for supplies. The day after, reverse it. Give yourself a week with each woman, doing real work, having real conversations. Then decide." The plan made sense, though Xavier doubted 2 weeks would be sufficient to determine a lifetime's compatibility. Still, it was better than any solution he'd devised. "There's something else troubling me," he admitted. "The woman I've been writing to, this combined person, mentioned wanting children, building a family. That's important to me after growing up in that orphanage back east." Eleanor's expression softened. "Then make sure whichever woman you choose shares that dream. This isn't just about you anymore, Xavier. You're choosing the mother of your future children, too." Xavier nodded solemnly. "I'll bring Miss Vance by this evening. And Eleanor? Thank you." As he rode back toward his ranch, Xavier's thoughts drifted to the letters he'd treasured these past months. The writer had seemed perfect, intelligent, resourceful, kind, with a subtle humor that had made him smile even on the coldest winter nights. Now he knew those qualities had been divided between 2 different women. Could either one alone fulfill the promise of those letters? Or had he been chasing an illusion all along? The situation reminded him uncomfortably of his search for Elizabeth. 3 years of following false leads and hoping for closure, only to be left with questions. He couldn't afford another mistake of the heart. As his homestead came into view, Xavier noticed something unusual. Jane Vickers in his garden patch, kneeling in the dirt despite her good traveling clothes. She appeared to be examining the soil, testing its texture between her fingers. The sight stirred something unexpected in him, a simple appreciation for her practical nature. When she stood and turned toward the house, Xavier saw Julia at the window, watching Jane with an unreadable expression. Something in that watchful gaze raised the hair on his neck, though he couldn't say why. One thing was certain: the next 2 weeks would determine the course of all their lives. Jane stared out the window of Xavier's wagon as they made their way towards Silver Creek. After 2 days at the Hawkins homestead, with Julia now comfortably installed at Mrs. Tate's, Jane finally had an opportunity to speak privately with Xavier. The man beside her handled the reins with easy confidence, though his conversation remained stilted and formal. "The general store should have everything on your list," he said, breaking a lengthy silence. "William Baker carries a good selection of seeds, if you're still planting that garden." "I am," Jane replied, "though I noticed your soil will need amendment before planting. It's rather alkaline." Xavier glanced at her with surprise. "You can tell that just by looking?" "By feeling and tasting," Jane corrected. "My father was an avid gardener. He taught me to understand soil the way others read books." Xavier's expression softened slightly. "My garden attempts have been limited in their success. I've focused more on the cattle operation, which appears quite prosperous," Jane observed. The 100 or so head of cattle she'd seen represented significant wealth on the frontier. "It's been a good few years," Xavier acknowledged. "I started with just 20 head. Built everything you see myself." Pride underlay his matter-of-fact statement. Deserved pride, Jane thought. What he'd accomplished alone in this wilderness was remarkable. The silence between them grew comfortable as the wagon rolled over the prairie, wildflowers dotting the landscape in splashes of yellow and purple. "May I ask you something, Mr. Hawkins?" Jane finally ventured. "Xavier, please." He kept his eyes on the trail. "If we're considering marriage, first names seem appropriate." "Xavier," Jane repeated, testing the unusual name. "Who is Elizabeth?" His hands tightened visibly on the reins. "Where did you hear that name?" "I noticed the letter on your desk," Jane admitted. "I wasn't prying, but the name was visible." Xavier was quiet so long that Jane thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of old pain. "Elizabeth Harper was my fiancée 3 years ago. We met in Denver when I was selling cattle. She agreed to come to Montana once I'd established the ranch properly." His jaw tightened. "She never arrived. Simply disappeared. I've spent years trying to discover what happened, if she's even alive." Jane absorbed this revelation. "And Sheriff Thompson's letter? Has he found her?" Xavier shook his head. "Another dead end. A woman matching her description passed through Wyoming 2 years ago, but the trail went cold again." "I'm sorry," Jane said softly. "That uncertainty must be difficult to bear." Xavier gave her a sidelong glance. "It's why I finally decided to seek a mail-order bride. I couldn't keep chasing a ghost." His tone suggested the subject was closed. They traveled in silence until the small town of Silver Creek appeared on the horizon. Jane had expected little more than a collection of rough buildings, but the settlement proved more established than she'd anticipated. A main street lined with false-fronted businesses stretched for several blocks, with neat houses spreading outward from the center. A church spire and schoolhouse stood at the far end, while the customary saloons and livery stables occupied the town's entrance. As Xavier guided the wagon down the main street, Jane noted the curious glances directed their way. Several people called greetings to Xavier, their eyes lingering on Jane with undisguised interest. "Word travels quickly here," Xavier murmured. "They've likely already heard about my unusual situation." Jane felt her cheeks warm. "Will that be a problem?" "Only if we let it become one." He pulled the wagon to a stop before a large general store. "Baker's has everything we need. I'll introduce you to William and his wife, Sarah. Good people." The store proved cavernous, filled with everything from sugar barrels to farming implements. Jane breathed in the comforting aromas of coffee, leather, and spices as an older man approached, his round face breaking into a wide smile. "Xavier Hawkins. And this must be your bride." He extended a hand to Jane. "William Baker, ma'am. Welcome to Silver Creek." "Jane Vickers," she replied, noting that Xavier made no correction about her status. William's wife emerged from behind a fabric counter, her pleasant features alight with curiosity. "We've been so eager to meet you." Xavier has been our most confirmed bachelor for years. Xavier cleared his throat. Jane needs some household supplies and garden seeds. I'll be back in an hour. Need to see Thompson about some business. After he departed, Sarah Baker linked her arm through Jane's. Now, dear, you must tell me everything. How did you meet our Xavier? And what about this other woman we've heard arrived on the same coach? Jane hesitated, uncertain how to explain without causing further gossip. Before she could formulate a response, the store's door swung open, and a striking woman in an expensive-looking burgundy dress entered. Her dark hair was elegantly arranged, and she carried herself with unmistakable confidence. "Veronica," Sarah greeted, her tone cooling noticeably. "What brings you to town?" The newcomer's gaze fixed on Jane with laser intensity. "Just picking up a few things, Sarah? And perhaps meeting Xavier's new friend." She extended a gloved hand. "Veronica Turner. My father owns the bank here in Silver Creek." Jane introduced herself, immediately sensing this woman's interest was far from casual. "Jane is Xavier's mail-order bride," Sarah supplied, emphasis on the possessive. Something flashed in Veronica's eyes. Disappointment? Anger? It vanished too quickly to identify. "How industrious of Xavier to send away for a wife," Veronica said smoothly. Though many of us wondered why he felt the need to look so far afield when suitable matches exist right here in Montana territory. The implication hung in the air between them. Clearly, Veronica Turner had her own designs on Xavier Hawkins. "Sometimes," Jane replied carefully, "what one needs isn't always found in the most obvious places." Veronica's smile tightened. "Indeed. Well, I hope frontier life isn't too shocking after Boston. It takes a special constitution to thrive out here." Her gaze swept over Jane's modest traveling outfit. Not everyone is suited to the hardships. Before Jane could respond, the door opened again, and Xavier entered with a man wearing a sheriff's badge. They stopped short at the tableau before them. "Veronica," Xavier acknowledged with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you in town today. Just welcoming your Eastern bride," Veronica replied, her tone warming considerably. "Someone should introduce her to proper society, Xavier. Perhaps dinner at my father's house this weekend? Mother would be delighted to host you both." Jane watched Xavier's face carefully. His expression remained neutral, but something in his stance suggested tension. "That's kind, but we're still getting settled," he deflected. "Sheriff Thompson, have you met Miss Vickers?" The weathered lawman tipped his hat. "Ma'am, welcome to Montana." As introductions continued, Jane caught Veronica studying her with calculation. The woman clearly viewed her as competition, though whether for Xavier specifically or merely as an outsider encroaching on territory Veronica considered her own, Jane couldn't determine. One thing became abundantly clear. Choosing between Jane and Julia wasn't Xavier's only matrimonial consideration. Veronica Turner represented a third option, one with local connections, wealth, and established position. An option that might prove far more beneficial to a rancher looking to expand his holdings than either mail-order bride. The realization sent an unexpected pang through Jane's heart. She'd come west seeking security and partnership, yes, but in the brief time she'd spent with Xavier, something else had begun to take root, a genuine admiration for his quiet strength and integrity. The thought that he might choose Veronica for practical advantages left her strangely hollow. As Xavier concluded his business with the sheriff, Jane noticed him slip a folded paper into his pocket. Another letter about Elizabeth, perhaps? The mystery of his former fiancée still hung between them, unresolved. How could any woman compete with a ghost, or with the very tangible advantages offered by someone like Veronica Turner? For the first time since arriving in Montana, Jane wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. *****, Julia Vance arranged the wildflowers she'd gathered in a small vase on Eleanor Tate's kitchen table. The elderly woman had proven surprisingly congenial company, though Julia remained cautious about revealing too much of herself. 3 days into her stay, she'd already learned more about Xavier Hawkins from Eleanor than from the man himself. "He built that piano in his parlor by hand," Eleanor was saying as she kneaded bread dough. "Ordered the mechanical parts from back east, but constructed the cabinet himself. Music means something special to him." Julia filed this information away. "Does he play?" "Not well," Eleanor chuckled. "But he tries. His mother was a concert pianist before she married, he told me once. Died when he was young. And his father?" Julia prompted. Eleanor's hands stilled briefly. Never knew him. Xavier was raised in an orphanage in Pennsylvania. Built himself from nothing, that boy has. This aligned with fragments Xavier had shared in his letters. Julia felt a flicker of sympathy, quickly suppressed. Sentiment was dangerous when making practical decisions, and choosing Xavier Hawkins as a husband would be the most practical decision of her life. Boston had offered Julia nothing but declining prospects. At 26, she'd been facing spinsterhood after her fiancé abandoned her for a younger, wealthier bride. The school where she taught music had closed, and without family support, her options had dwindled. A mail-order marriage represented security, a chance to be mistress of her own household rather than dependent on the charity of increasingly distant relatives. Xavier's ranch, from what she'd observed, offered better prospects than she'd dared hope. The cattle operation was substantial, the land holdings extensive, and the house itself surprisingly comfortable. If she could secure her position as his wife, Julia's future would be assured. The only obstacle was Jane Vickers, with her earnest manner and apparent knowledge of agriculture. Julia had to admit the woman posed legitimate competition. Where Julia offered refinement and social graces, Jane brought practical skills better suited to frontier life. The question was which Xavier valued more. Eleanor, Julia began carefully. What sort of woman do you think would suit Xavier best? The older woman looked up from her dough, her shrewd eyes narrowing slightly. Fishing for advantages, are you? Julia felt her face warm. Simply trying to understand my situation. Eleanor wiped flour from her hands. Xavier needs someone who sees him, not his property or his prospects, but him. That boy has spent his life building something to prove his worth. He doesn't need someone who only values what he's built. The gentle rebuke stung more than Julia expected. She turned to the window, arranging her expression before facing Eleanor again. You misunderstand me, she said smoothly. I admire accomplishment. Xavier has clearly worked tremendously hard. Eleanor responded noncommittally. He'll be coming for you soon. Taking you into Silver Creek today, isn't he? Julia nodded, her mind already calculating how to use this opportunity. Unlike Jane, who'd grown up in modest circumstances, Julia had been raised in a merchant family with social aspirations. She understood how to navigate society, how to make connections that could benefit Xavier's standing in the community. She would demonstrate those skills today. When Xavier's wagon appeared on the horizon, Julia was waiting on the porch in her best traveling ensemble, a cornflower blue dress that complemented her fair coloring, with a matching parasol to shield her complexion from the harsh prairie sun. She'd arranged her blonde hair in an elegant but practical style, wanting to appear both refined and adaptable. You look lovely, Eleanor commented, joining her on the porch. But remember, appearances matter less out here than substance. Julia smiled tightly. In my experience, Eleanor, appearances always matter. Xavier greeted them both with polite formality, helping Julia into the wagon with a firm hand. As they set off toward town, Julia noted the easy way he handled the horses, the confident set of his shoulders. He was more handsome than his letters had suggested, in a rugged, unpolished way that contrasted sharply with the sophisticated men she'd known in Boston. Did you enjoy your stay with Mrs. Tate? Xavier asked, breaking the silence. She's a remarkable woman, Julia replied truthfully. Very insightful. Xavier's mouth quirked in a half-smile. And very forthright. I imagine she had plenty to say about our situation. She seems to hold you in high regard, Julia offered. She mentioned you built your piano yourself. I was impressed. It's a beautiful instrument. This opening produced the response Julia hoped for. Xavier began describing how he'd constructed the piano cabinet, revealing both technical skill and genuine passion for music. Julia shared her own musical background, emphasizing points of connection between them. Perhaps I could play for you sometime, she suggested. I brought sheet music in my trunk. I'd like that, Xavier replied, his expression warming slightly. There's precious little music out here, save for what drifts out of the saloons on Saturday nights. Julia seized the opportunity to demonstrate her understanding of his circumstances. Frontier life demands practicality, but that doesn't mean sacrificing beauty entirely. A home needs warmth beyond what a hearth provides. Xavier studied her briefly, something unreadable in his expression. You sound like my mother, according to the stories I've heard. She insisted on bringing her piano west when she married, despite the difficulties of transport. A wise woman, Julia commented. May I ask what happened to your parents? Xavier's jaw tightened slightly. Influenza took them both when I was 8. I ended up at St. Michael's Home for Boys in Philadelphia. I'm sorry, Julia said, genuine sympathy coloring her tone. Losing parents is difficult at any age. You mentioned losing your own recently, Xavier prompted. Julia nodded, carefully navigating the fabrication in her letters. Her parents weren't dead, merely estranged after they'd opposed her engagement to a man they considered beneath their station. When that engagement had later dissolved anyway, pride had prevented reconciliation. They died within months of each other, she said, the lie practiced and smooth. Father's heart, then mother's simply, faded away. Xavier's expression softened with empathy. Creating something new from loss. It takes courage. I respect your decision to come west. Guilt pricked at Julia's conscience, but she pushed it aside. Everyone crafted narratives to present themselves advantageously. Her modified history simply made her a more suitable candidate for Xavier's affections. As Silver Creek came into view, Julia prepared herself to make a favorable impression. The town was more developed than she'd expected, with proper businesses and what appeared to be established society. The community has grown substantially in recent years, Xavier explained. The railroad spur coming through next year will change everything. Julia immediately recognized the business opportunity this represented. Your cattle operation must be poised to benefit considerably. Xavier looked mildly surprised at her observation. Yes, actually. Direct shipping to eastern markets will increase profits significantly. My father was in shipping, Julia improvised. He always said infrastructure determines prosperity. Xavier nodded thoughtfully as he guided the wagon down the main street. Several people called greetings, their curious gazes lingering on Julia. Xavier made brief introductions as they passed, until they reached a handsome 2-story building with Silver Creek Bank painted in gold letters across its facade. I need to deposit some funds, Xavier explained. Won't take long. Inside the bank, Julia noted the tasteful furnishings. Clearly this institution served a prosperous clientele. A distinguished-looking man in his 50s emerged from a back office, his face lighting with recognition. Xavier, twice in town within a week, must be a record. His gaze shifted to Julia with undisguised interest. And who might this lovely lady be? Julia Vance, Xavier introduced her. Miss Vance, this is Herbert Turner, president of Silver Creek Bank. Julia offered her most charming smile. A pleasure, Mr. Turner. You've created a most impressive establishment. Turner puffed up visibly at the compliment. We serve the territory's growing needs. Are you visiting our community, Miss Vance? Before Julia could respond, a striking dark-haired woman emerged from the back office. Father, the Simmons mortgage papers are ready for. She stopped short upon seeing Xavier and Julia. Ah, Veronica, Turner said. You remember Xavier Hawkins? And this is Miss Vance. The woman's assessing gaze swept over Julia with barely concealed hostility. How interesting. I met Miss Vickers yesterday. You've been quite busy, Xavier. Julia felt Xavier stiffen beside her. Miss Vance is staying with Eleanor Tate temporarily, he said, his tone neutral. 2 mail-order brides, Veronica mused, her voice carrying just enough to attract attention from others in the bank. How progressive of you, Xavier. Julia watched the interaction with keen interest. The tension between Xavier and this woman suggested history, and Veronica's territorial manner indicated she considered herself a contender for Xavier's attentions. Progressive indeed, Julia interjected smoothly. Mr. Hawkins is simply being thorough in determining the most suitable partner for his future. A refreshing approach compared to the hasty judgments often made in such matters. Veronica's eyes narrowed slightly. Thorough. Yes, that's one word for it. The remainder of their bank business proceeded with cool efficiency. As they departed, Julia noted the speculative glances following them. Clearly, Xavier's unusual situation had become common knowledge. I apologize for that awkwardness, Xavier said as they returned to the wagon. Veronica can be direct. She seems to have a particular interest in your affairs, Julia observed carefully. Xavier sighed. Her father has been suggesting a match between us for years. Consolidating land holdings through marriage is common practice out here. And you've resisted this convenient arrangement because... Xavier gave her a sidelong glance. Marriage should be more than a business transaction, Miss Vance. Julia felt her carefully constructed facade wobble slightly. Even out here, where practical considerations must surely outweigh sentiment. Especially out here, Xavier replied quietly. When you face hardship together day after day, you need more than practical compatibility. You need someone who makes the struggle worthwhile. His words struck something deep within Julia. A part of herself she'd deliberately walled off after her fiancé's betrayal. She'd convinced herself that security and position were all that mattered in marriage, that emotional attachment was a luxury she couldn't afford. But Xavier Hawkins, this quiet rancher who'd built everything from nothing, seemed to believe otherwise. The realization was deeply unsettling. As they continued their errands through town, Julia found herself watching Xavier with new eyes. He treated everyone with the same straightforward respect, from the blacksmith to the preacher's wife. There was no artifice in him, no performance for different audiences. The quality was so foreign to her Boston experience that she hardly knew how to interpret it. By the time they headed back toward Eleanor's homestead, Julia's carefully ordered thoughts were in disarray. She'd come to Montana seeking security through marriage to a successful rancher. She hadn't anticipated finding a man whose integrity might make her question her own. As Xavier's ranch came into view in the distance, Julia caught sight of Jane Vickers in the garden plot, working alongside Eleanor. The two women were laughing as they turned soil, Jane's auburn hair escaping its pins in the breeze. Julia felt an unexpected twist of something that might have been envy, not for Xavier's attention, but for Jane's apparent comfort in this place, her unguarded enjoyment of simple labor. When had Julia last allowed herself such unaffected pleasure? She's good with growing things, Xavier commented, following Julia's gaze. Started planning a proper kitchen garden yesterday. The simple approval in his tone told Julia more than any lengthy speech could have. Xavier valued competence and genuine contribution, not the social graces and connections Julia had assumed would sway him. For the first time, Julia wondered if she might be competing for a man she didn't truly understand. And worse, if winning might not bring the security she sought after all. The next 5 days established a rhythm at Xavier's homestead. Each morning, Jane tended the newly prepared garden while Xavier worked with his cattle. Afternoons were spent on various projects around the property, mending fences, repairing a leak in the roof, organizing the root cellar for future harvests. In the evenings, Xavier would ride to Eleanor's to spend time with Julia, returning with thoughtful expressions that Jane couldn't decipher. On the 6th day, Eleanor and Julia came to the ranch for Sunday dinner. Jane had spent the morning preparing a hearty meal, conscious that her domestic skills were being silently evaluated. Julia arrived wearing a pretty yellow dress that complemented her fair coloring, carrying a basket of fresh-baked rolls. Eleanor taught me her recipe, Julia explained, her smile revealing genuine pride in the accomplishment. The four of them settled around Xavier's dining table, an unexpectedly comfortable gathering despite the underlying tension of their unusual arrangement. Eleanor carried much of the conversation, recounting stories of early settlement days that had them all laughing. Xavier nearly shot his own foot off the first time he tried to hunt elk, Eleanor recalled, eyes twinkling. Came limping back to my place looking so dejected I hadn't the heart to tease him. Xavier chuckled, surprisingly at ease with the story. I've improved since then. Brought down that buck that's mounted in the parlor last fall. A fine specimen, Julia commented. You must be an excellent shot now. Jane's the better shot, actually, Xavier said, glancing at Jane. We practiced with my rifle yesterday. 5 cans and 5 shots at 50 yards. Jane felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. My father taught me. He believed women should be able to defend themselves. A progressive viewpoint, Julia observed, her tone carefully neutral. My father considered firearms unladylike. Different worlds required different skills, Eleanor interjected diplomatically. Speaking of which, Julia played Xavier's piano yesterday evening. Beautifully, I might add. Xavier nodded. Chopin, wasn't it? Reminded me of my mother's playing. The conversation flowed easily from there, touching on music, books, and the approaching summer season. Jane found herself watching the interactions, particularly the way Xavier responded to both her and Julia. With Jane, he was relaxed, their shared experiences of the past week providing common ground. With Julia, there was a certain formality, but also genuine appreciation for her refined manners and cultural knowledge. After dinner, Eleanor insisted on helping Jane with the dishes, while Xavier showed Julia the improvements to the barn. As they worked side by side at the wash basin, Eleanor spoke quietly. "He's still trying to decide, you know? Neither of you is what he expected." Jane nodded, keeping her voice equally low. "I've gathered as much. The situation is impossible for everyone." Eleanor handed her another plate to dry. "Not impossible, just complicated. Xavier values honesty above all else, Jane. Remember that." Before Jane could ask what she meant, the older woman continued. "He received another letter about Elizabeth yesterday, from a doctor in Wyoming." Jane nearly dropped the plate. "Has she been found?" "No," Eleanor sighed. "But the doctor treated a woman matching her description 2 months ago. She was going by another name, but the details align. Apparently, she mentioned Montana several times during her fever." Jane considered this information carefully. "Does he still love her?" Eleanor's weathered hands stilled in the soapy water. "I think he loves the memory of what might have been. Elizabeth represented a future he'd planned for years. Letting go of that future has been harder than letting go of the woman." The insight matched Jane's own observations of Xavier, a man who built methodically toward specific goals, whose every action served a larger purpose. Abandonment by Elizabeth would have disrupted not just his heart, but his entire life's blueprint. "What will he do if she's found?" Jane asked quietly. Eleanor shrugged. "That depends on why she disappeared in the first place, I suppose, and on what he feels for whoever he chooses between you and Julia." Jane felt a sudden wave of uncertainty. She'd begun to develop genuine feelings for Xavier, admiration for his steadfast nature, appreciation for his quiet kindness, and increasingly, a warm flutter whenever their hands accidentally touched or their eyes met across a room. The thought that he might still be emotionally bound to Elizabeth cast a shadow over these budding feelings. "I don't want to be someone's second choice," Jane admitted softly. Eleanor squeezed her shoulder gently. "None of us do, dear. But sometimes life's paths are more winding than we expect. Xavier's a good man trying to do right by everyone. That's worth something." Their conversation ended as Xavier and Julia returned from the barn, Julia animatedly describing improvements she envisioned for the property. Jane noted the proprietary way Julia gestured, already imagining herself as mistress of the homestead. A covered walkway between the house and barn would be practical for winter months, Julia was saying, and perhaps dormers in the roof to create additional bedrooms for. She stopped abruptly, color rising in her cheeks. For children, Jane mentally finished the unspoken thought. The implication hung in the air, bringing the underlying purpose of their arrangement into sharp focus. Whichever woman Xavier chose would be expected to bear his children, to help create the family he'd never had. The reminder stirred complicated emotions in Jane. She'd always wanted children, had enjoyed teaching partly because of her love for young minds. The thought of raising children on this beautiful, wild land, teaching them to grow food from the soil and appreciate the vast skies overhead, it created a yearning she hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. Additional space would be useful, Xavier agreed carefully, his gaze shifting briefly to Jane. The house was built with a family in mind. The evening concluded with Eleanor announcing it was time to return to her homestead. As Xavier helped the women into his wagon, his hand lingered briefly on Jane's, the contact sending warmth up her arm despite the cooling evening air. "I enjoyed your cooking," he said quietly. "Reminds me of meals I imagined when building this place." The simple statement revealed more than elaborate compliments could have. Jane realized Xavier wasn't just evaluating her practical skills. He was measuring both women against a vision he'd carried for years. As the wagon pulled away with Eleanor and Julia, Jane remained on the porch, watching until they disappeared into the gathering dusk. Xavier's 2-week time frame for making his decision was half over. Soon, one woman would become his wife, while the other would need to create a new future from dashed expectations. Jane only hoped that whoever Xavier chose would be the woman his heart truly wanted, not just the one who best fit the role he needed filled. Xavier leaned against the corral fence, watching the sun rise over his eastern pasture. Sleep had proven elusive, his mind churning with the decision that could no longer be postponed. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since Jane and Julia's arrival, and the entire community buzzed with speculation about which woman would become Mrs. Hawkins. Both women had proven themselves worthy partners, though in different ways. Jane's practical skills and gentle strength would make her an excellent partner in building the ranch. Her knowledge of growing things had already improved his garden prospects considerably, and her calm approach to daily challenges matched his own temperament. Julia, meanwhile, brought refinement and vision that could elevate his standing in the territory. Her musical talents and social graces would introduce beauty to his utilitarian existence. She demonstrated unexpected adaptability, learning homesteading skills from Eleanor with determined enthusiasm. Either woman would make a suitable wife. The problem, Xavier reflected ruefully, was that neither fully matched the composite person he'd imagined from their letters. That imaginary woman had been perfect, combining Jane's practical knowledge with Julia's cultural refinement, blending strength with gentleness in precisely the balance he sought. Caught in your thoughts again? Eleanor's voice interrupted his reverie. She approached carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Brought you some fresh bread. Figured you might need sustenance for decision-making. Xavier accepted the basket gratefully. You're up and about early. Julia's still sleeping, Eleanor replied, leaning against the fence beside him. Girl was up half the night practicing bread making, determined to prove she can manage a household. Xavier sighed heavily. She shouldn't have to prove anything. Neither of them should. This situation is entirely my fault. Not entirely, Eleanor countered. That matchmaking service bears some responsibility, but dwelling on blame won't solve your problem. She fixed him with a penetrating gaze. Have you made your choice? Xavier rubbed his jaw, feeling the stubble he'd neglected to shave. I've tried to be methodical. Listed qualities, considered compatibility, imagined future years. And my mind reaches one conclusion while my heart suggests another, he admitted. The practical choice isn't necessarily what I find myself wanting. Eleanor nodded sagely. The heart has its own wisdom, Xavier. Sometimes better than all our careful planning. She paused, her expression growing serious. There's something else you should know before you decide. I've been watching both women carefully. Jane is exactly who she presents herself to be, straightforward, genuine, her motives transparent. Xavier waited, sensing Eleanor's hesitation. Julia, however, Eleanor chose her words with care. There are inconsistencies in her stories, small things that don't align. When speaking of her deceased parents, details change. Sometimes her father was a merchant, other times involved in shipping. Sometimes her mother died first, sometimes her father. Xavier frowned. You think she's being deliberately deceptive? I think, Eleanor said gently, that she's crafting a narrative she believes will appeal to you. Whether her parents are actually deceased, I couldn't say, but she's certainly embellishing her history. The revelation shouldn't have surprised Xavier, yet it stung. He'd valued honesty above all else since childhood, when orphanage life had taught him the currency of truth among boys with nothing else to trade. I'll speak with her today, he decided. Give her an opportunity to explain. A wise approach, Eleanor agreed. And what about Sheriff Thompson's latest letter? Have you told either woman about Elizabeth possibly being found? Xavier shook his head. The lead seems substantial this time. A woman matching Elizabeth's description is working as a schoolteacher in a small town near Cheyenne. Thompson's deputy is traveling there next week to investigate. And if it is her? Eleanor pressed. Xavier had asked himself that question repeatedly over the past days. 3 years had passed since Elizabeth's disappearance. 3 years of building his life without her, of gradually accepting that whatever had caused her to vanish, she'd chosen not to include him in her future. If it's her, I'll finally get answers, he said slowly. But I don't think those answers will change my current situation. Too much time has passed. Eleanor studied him carefully. You're no longer in love with her. It wasn't a question, but Xavier answered anyway. I loved who I thought she was. But someone who could disappear without explanation isn't the person I believed her to be. He straightened, decision crystallizing. I need to speak with Jane and Julia separately today. By sundown, I'll have made my choice. Eleanor squeezed his arm supportively. Listen to your heart, Xavier. It's wiser than you give it credit for. As Eleanor departed, Xavier remained by the corral, watching his horses graze in the morning light. The decision before him would shape not just his future, but the lives of 2 women who had crossed a continent based on his promise. Julia first, he decided. She deserved a chance to address Eleanor's concerns before he made his final decision. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Julia sat on a fallen log near the creek that bordered Eleanor's property, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Xavier had asked to speak with her privately, his serious expression suggesting this wasn't a casual conversation. Had he already made his choice? Was he about to inform her that Jane would become his wife? The thought created a surprising ache in her chest. Over the past 2 weeks, Julia had found herself genuinely drawn to this quiet, steadfast man, and to the life he offered. What had begun as a practical arrangement had evolved into something more complicated, something that threatened the emotional walls she'd carefully constructed after her fiancé's betrayal. Xavier approached along the creek bank, his tall figure silhouetted against the morning sun. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to physical labor, a stark contrast to the polished gentleman Julia had known in Boston. Yet there was nothing crude about Xavier Hawkins. His manners might be straightforward, but they stemmed from genuine respect rather than social convention. "Thank you for meeting me," Xavier said, settling beside her on the log. "I wanted to speak with you privately before making my decision." Julia smoothed her skirt, grateful she'd worn one of her better dresses. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Xavier. It's a significant decision for all of us." Xavier studied the bubbling creek for a moment before speaking. "Julia, I need to ask you something important, and I need your honest answer." He turned to face her directly. "Have you been completely truthful about your circumstances? About your family?" The directness of the question caught Julia off guard. She'd expected discussions of compatibility or future expectations, not this piercing inquiry into her carefully constructed narrative. She faltered, meeting his steady gaze. The lies that had flowed so easily before stuck in her throat. "Why do you ask?" "Eleanor has noticed inconsistencies in your stories," Xavier said gently. "I'm not here to judge your reasons, Julia, but I cannot build a marriage on falsehood." Something in his tone, not accusatory but simply seeking understanding, broke through Julia's carefully maintained facade. The pretense she'd maintained suddenly felt exhausting, a burden she'd carried across the continent. "My parents aren't dead," she admitted quietly, looking down at her clasped hands. "They're very much alive in Boston. We had a falling out. They disapproved of my engagement to a man they considered beneath our station. When he later broke our engagement anyway, I was too proud to return home." Xavier absorbed this without visible reaction. "And your teaching position?" "That part was true," Julia said quickly. "I did teach music and literature, but the school didn't close. I resigned when my position became uncomfortable after the broken engagement. Boston society can be unforgiving." "So you came west to escape gossip," Xavier surmised. Julia lifted her chin. "I came west to build a new life on my own terms." "Is that so different from what brought you to Montana?" A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, crossed Xavier's face. "No, it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Why construct the story about your parents' deaths?" "Because orphans garner sympathy," Julia answered with brutal honesty. "And because I thought a woman without family obligations would seem more appealing to a frontier rancher. No elderly parents who might need care, no siblings seeking financial assistance." "You crafted what you thought I wanted to hear," Xavier stated flatly. Julia felt shame color her cheeks. "Yes, I've spent my life learning to be what others expected, the perfect daughter, the accomplished young lady, the respectable teacher. Coming west seemed to require a different sort of performance." Xavier shook his head slowly. "Marriage isn't a performance, Julia, especially out here. When winter blizzards trap you indoors for weeks, when drought threatens your livelihood, when sickness comes, there's no room for pretense then. You stand together in truth, or you fall apart." His words struck something deep within Julia. How long had she been playing roles rather than simply living? The realization was both frightening and strangely liberating. "I understand if this changes your decision," she said quietly. "Jane has been honest from the start." Xavier surprised her by taking her hand gently. "People make mistakes, Julia. What matters is what you choose going forward. Can you set aside the performances? Can you be simply yourself, with all the strengths and weaknesses that entails?" The question hung between them, more challenging than Julia had expected. Who was she, without the careful construction of personae? Did she even know anymore? "I'm not sure I remember how," she admitted, the honesty feeling strange on her tongue. but I would like to learn. Xavier nodded slowly. That's a start. He released her hand and stood. I need to speak with Jane now. By evening, I'll have made my decision. As he walked away, Julia remained on the log, feeling oddly unburdened despite the uncertainty of her situation. For the first time in years, she'd spoken her truth without calculation or performance. Whether or not Xavier chose her, that small liberation felt significant. A first step toward becoming the person she might have been without society's expectations shaping her every move. Jane knelt in the garden plot behind Xavier's house, carefully planting the seedlings she'd started in small pots. The physical work helped calm her nerves as she awaited Xavier's return. Eleanor had informed her that he was speaking with Julia this morning, and Jane could guess the purpose of that conversation. His decision was coming, perhaps as soon as today. The thought created a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. 2 weeks in Montana Territory had transformed Jane's perspective in unexpected ways. What had begun as a practical arrangement for security had evolved into genuine attachment, not just to the land, with its breathtaking vistas and promising soil, but to the man himself. Xavier Hawkins was unlike any man she'd known in Boston. Beneath his reserved exterior lay both gentle kindness and unwavering strength. He approached problems methodically, but remained adaptable when circumstances changed. Most compelling was his fundamental decency, the way he treated every person with equal respect, from Eleanor to the stable boy in town. Jane had found herself imagining a future here. Children running across the open prairie, family meals in the cozy kitchen, quiet evenings reading aloud, while Xavier carved wooden toys by the fireplace. The vision had taken root in her heart, making the prospect of his choosing Julia increasingly painful to contemplate. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Xavier emerged from around the house, his expression unreadable as he approached the garden plot. "Those seedlings look promising," he commented, crouching beside her to examine the neat rows. "They should produce well if the weather holds," Jane replied, brushing soil from her hands. "I've staggered the plantings to ensure continuous harvest through fall." Xavier nodded appreciatively. "You think several seasons ahead. That's valuable out here." The simple praise warmed her. "My father always said gardening teaches patience and foresight. You can't rush growth any more than you can prevent winter." "Wise man, your father." "He was," Jane agreed, a familiar pang of loss softened by fond memories. "He would have appreciated your homestead. He always dreamed of having land like this, enough space to grow and build without city constraints." Xavier studied her for a moment. "You've adapted well to this place. Better than I expected for someone raised in Boston." "Boston was where I lived, but perhaps not where I belonged," Jane said thoughtfully. "I've felt more at home here in 2 weeks than in years back east." A comfortable silence fell between them as Jane continued planting and Xavier assisted, handing her seedlings from the tray. This easy companionship had developed naturally over their days working together, a rhythm that required no words, each anticipating the other's needs. "I spoke with Julia this morning," Xavier finally said, his voice carefully neutral. Jane's hands stilled briefly before continuing their work. "I assumed as much." There were inconsistencies in her story that needed addressing. Jane looked up, surprised. "Inconsistencies?" Xavier nodded, explaining Julia's admissions about her family and circumstances. Jane listened without interrupting, her heart conflicted. Part of her felt vindicated that her honest approach had proven worthwhile, while another part empathized with Julia's desperate attempt to create a new beginning. "She was frightened," Jane said when Xavier finished. "Starting over is terrifying, especially when you've lost everything familiar." Xavier studied her with an unreadable expression. "You defend her deception?" "I understand it," Jane clarified. "Fear makes people build protective walls. Julia's happened to be constructed from carefully crafted stories." Xavier's expression softened. "Your compassion does you credit, Jane." A comfortable silence settled between them again as they finished planting the last row of seedlings. Jane brushed soil from her skirt as they stood, aware of Xavier watching her with unusual intensity. "There's something else you should know before I make my decision," he said finally. "Something I've mentioned only to Eleanor until now." Jane nodded encouragingly. "My former fiancée, Elizabeth, there's reason to believe she's been located." The revelation caught Jane off guard. You found her? After 3 years. Xavier explained about the schoolteacher near Cheyenne who matched Elizabeth's description. Sheriff Thompson's deputy is investigating next week. It may come to nothing, like previous leads, but if it's her, you'll finally have answers, Jane finished softly. Yes. Xavier's gaze drifted toward the distant mountains. Though I'm no longer certain what questions I would ask, Jane studied his profile, searching for signs of lingering attachment to this woman who had vanished from his life. If it is Elizabeth, would that change things? Your decision about. She gestured vaguely, unable to directly reference the choice between herself and Julia. Xavier turned to face her directly. No, whatever happened with Elizabeth is in the past. 3 years ago, her disappearance shattered the future I'd planned. But I've built something new since then, this ranch, this life. His expression grew earnest. And now I'm looking for someone to share it with, someone whose presence would make it complete. The simple sincerity in his voice touched something deep in Jane's heart. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Sheriff Thompson appeared on the horizon, riding at an urgent pace toward the homestead. Xavier frowned. Thompson wasn't due back until next week. They walked together to meet the sheriff as he dismounted in the yard, his expression grave beneath his dust-covered hat. Xavier, Thompson nodded curtly. Miss Vickers, sorry to interrupt, but there's news you need to hear. About Elizabeth? Xavier asked immediately. Thompson shook his head. Not directly, but it might explain what happened to her. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. This telegram came from Denver yesterday. A man named James Forsyth was arrested there for swindling multiple women through false marriage promises. Xavier accepted the telegram, scanning it quickly. What does this have to do with Elizabeth? Forsyth's method was consistent, Thompson explained. He'd identify women traveling alone, particularly those headed west to meet prospective husbands. He'd charm them, convince them their intended matches were unsuitable or dangerous, then offer protection while stealing their valuables and savings. Jane watched understanding dawn on Xavier's face. You think Elizabeth encountered this man on her journey, Xavier said slowly. That she never intentionally abandoned our plans. Thompson nodded grimly. Several of his victims were left penniless in remote locations, too ashamed to contact their families or former fiancés. The woman in Wyoming matching Elizabeth's description might well be one of them. The information seemed to lift a weight from Xavier's shoulders, not because it rekindled hope for reuniting with Elizabeth, Jane realized, but because it absolved the woman of deliberate cruelty. The abandonment that had haunted him for years suddenly had an explanation that preserved his memory of her character. Thank you, Thompson, Xavier said quietly. This helps. The sheriff departed after sharing additional details about the investigation, leaving Jane and Xavier standing in the yard as the sun climbed toward midday. Jane sensed that this revelation had shifted something fundamental for Xavier, closing a chapter that had remained painfully unfinished. I should return to the garden, Jane said, giving him space to process this new information. There's still much to, Jane, Xavier interrupted gently, taking her hand. I've made my decision. Her heart seemed to stop, then race forward. About who I want to share my life with. His eyes held her steadily. I've known for several days, if I'm honest with myself. Today only confirmed what my heart had already decided. Jane held her breath, afraid to hope, yet unable to stop herself. From the moment you knelt in my garden testing the soil, something felt right about your presence here, Xavier continued. Working beside you these past 2 weeks has shown me what a true partnership could be. Not just sharing labor, but sharing vision and purpose. Joy began to bubble up within Jane, but she contained it, needing to hear his choice explicitly. Julia brings many fine qualities, Xavier acknowledged. But you, Jane Vickers, feel like home to me. If you're willing, I'd like to marry you, not because of a mail-order arrangement or practical considerations, but because I believe we could build something beautiful together. The simple, heartfelt proposal brought tears to Jane's eyes. I would be honored to be your wife, Xavier. His smile transformed his usually serious face, revealing the depth of feeling he typically kept contained. Gently, he drew her closer, one hand cupping her cheek with surprising tenderness. May I? He asked softly. Jane nodded, her heart racing as Xavier leaned down to press his lips to hers, a gentle, questioning kiss that deepened as she responded. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her against his solid warmth as years of loneliness seemed to dissolve for them both. When they finally parted, Xavier kept her hand in his. "There's still the matter of Julia," he said, "and proper arrangements to be made." "Yes," Jane agreed, her practical nature reasserting itself despite her joy. "She deserves to hear your decision with dignity. And we'll need to speak with Reverend Collins about the ceremony." Xavier nodded, his expression growing serious again. "I've been thinking about Julia's situation. She has skills that would be valuable in Silver Creek. The school needs a music teacher, and with the new railway coming, the town is growing rapidly." "That's a thoughtful solution," Jane said, appreciating his concern for Julia's future. Together they walked toward the house, hands still linked, to prepare for the conversations ahead. As they reached the porch, Xavier paused, looking out over the land he'd built from nothing. "I came west seeking something I couldn't name," he said quietly. "Land and cattle were part of it, but not the whole. I think I was looking for belonging, a place and people that felt like home." Jane squeezed his hand gently. "And have you found it?" Xavier's smile returned as he gazed down at her. "I believe I have, though it arrived in a rather more complicated fashion than expected. Silver Creek, Montana Territory, 1883. The church bells rang joyously across the settlement as the wedding ceremony concluded. Jane Hawkins, no longer Vickers as of 10 minutes ago, emerged into the spring sunshine on her husband's arm, her simple white dress adorned with wildflowers from their own garden. The past month had transformed Jane's life in ways she could scarcely have imagined when stepping off the stagecoach into Xavier's yard. The mail-order mix-up that had brought both her and Julia to Montana had resolved itself with surprising grace, thanks largely to Eleanor Tate's practical wisdom and Xavier's fundamental decency. Julia had accepted Xavier's decision with dignity, if not without pain. Her initial shock had given way to pragmatic consideration of her options, and when Xavier mentioned Silver Creek's need for a music teacher, Julia had seized the opportunity. With a loan from Xavier to establish herself, she had taken rooms above the milliner's shop and begun offering piano and voice lessons to the town's growing population. To everyone's surprise, Julia and Veronica Turner had developed an unlikely friendship based on their shared appreciation for culture and refinement. Together they had established Silver Creek's first literary society, which now met weekly in the Turner parlor. Julia's natural social graces, freed from the burden of pretense, had flourished in the small community. The wedding guests surrounded Jane and Xavier, offering congratulations and well wishes. Eleanor Tate approached with tears in her eyes, embracing Jane warmly. "You've brought light back to that boy's eyes," she whispered. "I couldn't be happier for you both." Sheriff Thompson offered a hearty handshake to Xavier. "Got final confirmation yesterday," he said quietly. "The woman in Wyoming was indeed Elizabeth Harper. She's built a new life there, teaching school and engaged to the local doctor." Xavier nodded, his expression peaceful. "I'm glad she found her way. Please let her know that I wish her well." Jane squeezed his arm gently, understanding that this closure was the final healing of an old wound. The mystery that had haunted Xavier for years had been solved, allowing him to fully embrace his future without lingering questions about the past. Julia approached next, elegant in a pale blue dress that complemented her fair coloring. Her smile, though tinged with wistfulness, appeared genuine. "Congratulations to you both," she said, kissing Jane's cheek. "The ceremony was lovely." "Thank you for playing the music," Jane replied warmly. "No one else could have done it such justice." Julia's gaze moved between them. "You make a handsome couple. The ranch will thrive under your combined care." Xavier smiled. "And Silver Creek benefits from your talents, Julia. I hear your student roster has grown considerably. 17 pupils now," Julia confirmed with pride. "And the Literary Society has 12 members." She hesitated before adding, "I've also received a letter from my parents. They've expressed interest in reconciliation." "That's wonderful news," Jane said sincerely. "It is," Julia agreed. "Though I'm not certain I'll return east. Montana has shown me aspects of myself I never knew existed. I'm stronger than I believed." Her gaze lingered briefly on Xavier. "And I've learned that honesty, however difficult, offers a freedom that no carefully crafted story can provide." As the guests moved toward the wedding reception at the hotel, Xavier drew Jane slightly aside, his expression one of quiet contentment. "Happy, Mrs. Hawkins?" he asked softly. Jane smiled up at her husband, still marveling at the path that had brought them together. "Completely. Though I do wonder sometimes, if the matchmaking service hadn't confused our applications, if Julia had been your only bride, then I might never have discovered what I truly needed," Xavier finished for her. "Sometimes fate has wiser plans than our own careful arrangements." "A mail-order mix-up that delivered the perfect match," Jane mused. "Perhaps we should thank the disorganized clerk who confused our files." Xavier laughed, the sound still novel enough to delight Jane's ears. "I'll be thanking them every day for the next 50 years. He sobered slightly. "I've spent my life building this ranch, believing that land and livestock were the measure of a man's success. But this past month has shown me that home isn't about property. It's about the person who makes your heart recognize where it belongs." Jane stood on tiptoe to kiss him gently. "Then welcome home, Xavier Hawkins." As they walked hand in hand toward their waiting friends, Jane reflected on the journey that had brought her west. The teaching position lost, the parents mourned, the desperate leap of faith in becoming a mail-order bride, all had been necessary steps leading to this moment. What had seemed like misfortune and confusion had ultimately guided her to where she belonged. Sometimes, Jane thought as Xavier's hand tightened around hers, the most perfect matches arise from the most unexpected circumstances. Their future stretched before them, a homestead to develop, gardens to tend, and eventually, God willing, children to raise beneath Montana's vast sky. The life they would build together had begun with a simple mix-up of names, Jane Vickers and Julia Vance, but would grow into something neither could have imagined when boarding that eastbound train. In the distance, their homestead waited, no longer merely Xavier's achievement, but the foundation for their shared future. The garden Jane had planted was already showing green shoots reaching toward the sun, promising harvests to come. Like those tender seedlings, their marriage would require care and patience, but would ultimately bear fruit sweeter for the effort invested. The mail-order mix-up that had brought unexpected complications had ultimately delivered Jane to precisely where she was meant to be, beside a man whose quiet strength complemented her gentle resilience, in a land whose challenges would forge their partnership into something enduring and beautiful. And that, Jane reflected as she and Xavier joined their wedding celebration, was a perfect match indeed.